Please join me to welcome Mr. Stephan Lewandowsky. He's our first keynote speaker. And I'd like to introduce him a little bit. I'm sure you all already know about him. He is actually a cognitive scientist from University of Bristol from United Kingdom. And his most recent research interest is exploring the potential conflict between human cognition and the physics of global climate change. And he has been carrying out some collaborative research on this topic. And he holds an honorary position as a visiting scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. If you like to see about his CV, if you like to learn more, you can look at our website, especially his publications. I was going through his publications this morning and I was so impressed. There are a lot of interesting publications for us. So many things about disinformation and human cognition, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he's going to share with us today. So, Mr. Lewandowsky, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for the kind introduction. And okay, let's see. I'm trying to share. Aha, you should be able to see my screen now. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about the post-truth world and information discernment in terms of how people handle misinformation and its correction. So this is what I want to talk about today. I want to give you a brief thumbnail sketch of what I think the so-called post-truth world is and how we got there. I then want to explain, or at least propose an explanation for why it is that people accept post-truth politicians, at least some of the time. And then once I establish that it does actually matter, I want to tell you a little bit about countermeasures to misinformation that we have available. So to put this into context and to explain the post-truth world, I want to provide you with a brief history of lies. Now, it's not just lies, it is also other forms of deception, misstatements, and so on. And I've chosen American presidents to explain this to us because, well, we know a lot about American presidents and they're undergoing a lot of scrutiny. So if they have a problem with the truth, then sooner or later, we find out. Now, if you look at this, then this brief history starting out with Richard Nixon through Reagan and Clinton and Bush, et cetera, then one of the things you notice is that there's an increase in the quantity of false or misleading claims. Now, according to the Washington Post fact checkers, Donald Trump committed 21 false or misleading claims per day during his entire presidency on average. And this is undoubtedly more than any president before him. I mean, this is just a unique increase in the amount of misstatements by Donald Trump. But I think there's something else in this history that, to my mind, is even more important. And that is that in addition to an increase in quantity, we also have what I would call a qualitative shift in the nature of misinformation. Now, I would argue that going back in history prior to around 2005 or so, politicians' misstatements were carefully curated and had the intent of getting us to believe a different state of the world from what was actually true. But the intent was for us to believe something about the world. So, for example, George Bush wanted us to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Richard Nixon wanted us to believe that he was unaware of the Watergate break-in, and so on. Bill Clinton wanted us to believe something about his sex life that then turned out not to be true. In all those cases, though, there was a purpose to this, and that was for us to believe something about reality that wasn't actually true. Now, I would argue that during the last, let's say 10 years, maybe 5 to 10 years, there's been a shift away from this idea of trying to convince people that something about the world is a certain way when it isn't. A shift from that to what I call epistemic insouciance and shock and chaos disinformation, where it now appears as though the goal of people who sprout this misinformation is not even to make us believe it. It is simply to create so much noise that it becomes impossible for anybody to hold on to all the false information. And I would argue that this started, it became crucial on day one of Donald Trump's presidency, when the claim was made that his inauguration crowd was larger than that of any other president before. Now, that's false. That claim is so totally false, it takes seconds to debunk. All you got to do is look at the photographic evidence. His inauguration on the left, compare that to one on the right. Obama's inauguration crowd was far greater than that of Donald Trump. So, why? What's going on here? Why make a claim that is so blatantly false? And why make so many claims that often don't appear to have a specific purpose? Donald Trump used to say things that were wrong about issues that were of no consequence to his political welfare. Why? What's going on? Well, one of the things that's going on as a consequence of that is that the ontology of truth, that is our understanding of truth itself, changes through this constant insouciance and this assault on the very notion that we might agree on reality. And you can see that anecdotally in the statements that proponents of shock and chaos disinformation make. One of Donald Trump's mouthpieces, Kellyanne Conway, referred to alternative facts when she was challenged on the inauguration crowd issue. She said, "Oh, well, we have all alternative facts." And Nigel Farage, who's a populist politician in the United Kingdom, he's been very explicit. What I call a fact is your lie, and vice versa. Now, the moment you do that, you can, of course, ignore all challenges to your accuracy. If I have alternative facts, then all I got to say is, I have my alternative facts, end of story. Or you can do what Donald Trump does, which is very clever, which is to flip it around and to call anything you don't like fake news. And then you're no longer accountable. Now, that is fantastic if you're a powerful politician who wants to retain power and all they're concerned about is power and not accuracy. Sure, that works. But it has consequences for people's conceptions of honesty that are then later on problematic. Now, to illustrate what I mean by that, here's some public opinion data from throughout Donald Trump's presidency. And what you can see here is that his approval ratings were pretty invariant until the very end. This is when he lost the election, and then he did actually drop down a bit because of his refusal to accept the result. But other than that, it was pretty stable. And within his party, Donald Trump had support throughout. 3/4 of Republicans approved of him throughout the whole full 4 years. Not only that, but a similar margin of Republicans considered Donald Trump to be honest throughout his presidency. When they were asked, does Donald Trump speak the truth? 3/4 of Republicans said yes, most of the time. Among Democrats, it was, the majority was about 96% the other way. Only 3 or 4% of Democrats thought that he spoke the truth. So how can that be? Right? Here we have the fact checkers identifying 21 misleading claims per day, and yet his partisans say, oh, he's honest. So why is this accepted, this shock, chaos, disinformation, and epistemic insouciance? Now, there are a number of explanations for this that are out there that have been proposed. The one I want to share with you was proposed by Oliver Hall and colleagues a few years ago, and they refer to this as the authenticity of the lying demagogue. Now, I love that term because what it does, or what it tells us, is that people sometimes will accept politicians who lie to them if that lying is considered to be a marker of authenticity. So the claim that I would make is that Donald Trump's lies were a feature, not a bug. In fact, it was a signal to his followers that he is an authentic champion of the real people that are opposing the elite. Being honest, being educated are norms of the establishment or the elite in democratic societies. So within a populist logic, if you want to be a champion of the real people who are opposing those elites, of course, both of those are constructs that are of no, they have no real meaning, but populist politicians take that dividing line, construct these opposing camps, and then they say, oh, I'm your champion to the real people. I'm your champion, and you can tell I'm a champion because I'm lying so much that I'm violating this establishment norm. Now, this only works if people question the legitimacy of the system. Now, we know that from experiments conducted by Hall et al., who showed that truth-telling, like any other norm violation, is a signal of authenticity that's accepted only if the recipients, the targets of that misleading or false claims, if the targets have lost faith in the system and see it as being corrupt. And so the emergence of Donald Trump or other populists to whom lying is a feature, that was only possible because a significant share of the population had lost trust or felt left out or felt threatened by current political circumstances. At any other time, I'm convinced Donald Trump would have been laughed off the stage within the first week of his candidacy. It takes these special circumstances. But when these circumstances are present, then people participate in spreading falsehoods willingly for political purposes. Now, we know this from an experiment that was done 2 days after the inauguration of Donald Trump, in which people were shown these two famous pictures. Now, all they had to do in this experiment was to click on the photo that had more people in it, right? It's not a terribly difficult task. And by the way, the correct answer is photo B. A is just wrong. You cannot click on A without making a mistake. Now, let's look at the data and see what happened in that experiment. Well, what happened in that experiment is that people who didn't vote, or people who voted for Hillary Clinton, rarely picked the wrong photo. Those who did probably just slipped with a mouse, or the coffee had spilled on the keyboard, or something went wrong, that type of thing. But now look at Trump voters. Look in particular at Trump voters who are highly educated. Among highly educated Trump voters, 26% picked the wrong picture. Why? Well, I would argue that's probably because they knew exactly what was going on. They recognized the photos from the controversy in the media, and they expressed their support for their favorite candidate, the person they voted for, by saying, there are more people at his inauguration crowd, therefore I'm picking that picture, even though they knew perfectly well that there weren't more people in that picture. Now, That is what some people, myself included, have called participatory propaganda, meaning that people are indulging in the propagation of falsehoods themselves on behalf of a leader or on behalf of a political cause they are supporting. And we saw that in this experiment. And that was short-lived and tied to the controversy at that time, because I replicated that experiment together with a student about 18 months later, by which time the world had moved on and no one remembered the inauguration crowds. And by that time, no one among Republicans picked the wrong picture any longer, because it was no longer current. Republicans still thought the inauguration crowd was bigger than it actually was, but that's a very different error from picking the wrong picture to signal your support for a political candidate. So that's what the post-truth world, I would argue, consists of. That is how I would characterize it. Now, does that matter? Does it matter that people share false information? Does it matter that Donald Trump lies 21 times a day or makes misleading claims? Well, I would argue, yes, it does. And I would argue that we have sufficient data to make us concerned about the consequences of such falsehoods in public life. Now, there's a number of papers that have come out during the last 18 months related to the pandemic that isolated causal effects of certain media organs in the United States on people's behavior. And one of the things that's been found in two separate papers using some very clever statistical methodology is that watching Fox News makes people less likely to comply with social distancing measures, with flow-on consequences for the number of cases and fatalities. And we also know from other experiments that if you expose people to misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccines, that reduces their intent to get vaccinated. So there's clear evidence that exposure to misinformation matters. And we also know from literally decades of research now that misinformation sticks. That is, once people hear a falsehood, such as that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump, it's complete nonsense, then even if people encounter a correction, they may nonetheless rely on the misinformation. And the reason that happens is not because they want to, it is because when people listen to information in the world, they're building a situation model, a mental model of the world, one step at a time. Now, during construction of that mental model, if all of a sudden the key component of that turns out to be false, then what are you going to do? You got a hole in your mental model, so to speak, because a key element is ripped out. And that is when people may, on the one hand, tell us that they know something is false. I run these experiments all the time. You know, I tell people something that they just heard is actually false, and then people say, "Oh yeah, okay, now I know it's false," and they accept that. But then if I ask them something else that requires use of information in their memory, then all of a sudden the original false information still affects people's judgment and decision making. It's still in there, in that mental model, even though people know it's false. So you get these ironic effects where people rely on things that they know to be false. That is what makes misinformation problematic, because it lingers, it sticks in people's memory. And if the misinformation is packaged as a conspiracy theory, well, then things are particularly concerning, because conspiracy theories are an inevitable prerequisite for extremism, violent extremism. You're not going to find a violent extremist who's not also a believer in a conspiracy theory. I can almost guarantee you that. And that is what people who work on radicalization and extremism know. They say, yeah, you won't get that without a conspiracy theory. Now, that doesn't mean anybody who believes in a conspiracy theory is necessarily going to become violent or extremist, but it is certainly a necessary requirement to believe in a conspiracy theory to resort to violence. And we have seen quite a bit of violence during the pandemic, initially directed at telephone installations in the United Kingdom because of this baseless idea that COVID-19 was caused by mobile phone towers. Of course not. It's a virus, not a radio wave, but still that didn't keep some people from burning down and in fact physically assaulting telecommunications workers in the United Kingdom. So this matters. Living in a post-truth world in which misinformation has a lot of currency matters because it affects people's behavior at many, many different levels. And we've already seen that misinformation then becomes sticky and is difficult to dislodge. So what do we do? What can we do to deal with the post-truth world? Well, I want to focus on two things, time permitting, at least one of them, that I call inoculation. Now, inoculation has two elements, both of which are deployed before a person has been exposed to the misinformation. The first one is that people are being warned that they may be misled. And the second thing is that you rebut an anticipated false argument ahead of time before people have been exposed. Now, this requires advanced knowledge of how people might be misinformed, but it doesn't require knowledge of what exactly they will be encountered to. So that's kind of cool. Provided we know ahead of time how disinformers are misleading the public, we can use that for inoculation. But we don't have to know what exactly they're going to say. They always have new talking points. It's just that the misleading rhetoric, the techniques remain the same. And inoculation has been shown to work in a number of different contexts. I just want to give you some examples. I'll show you briefly a series of experiments that I conducted recently together with Sander van der Linden and John Rosenbeek at Cambridge, where what we did was to present people with brief 2-minute videos that inoculated them against misleading argumentation. Following that, participants then had to tell or differentiate between synthetic tweets that were either using the misleading technique or were not using them. Okay, so these experiments were extremely simple. Went online, got us a representative sample of 1,000 Americans on prolific. They were randomly put into a control group or the inoculation group. The control group saw some video about something completely irrelevant. The experimental group, the one that we're interested in, was inoculated with a video. In fact, I'll show you the video in just a moment because it's kind of interesting. A video that told them about what to expect and how they might be misled. Then people were presented with these tweets that were either manipulative or not, and they had to answer some questions about those tweets, which I'll also show you in a moment. And the emphasis was on people's ability to differentiate between good information and misleading information as a function of the inoculation. Okay, so a very simple experiment. I'm now hopefully going to show you the video.
You might think about skipping this ad. Don't. What happens next will make you tear up. Wait, you're still here? I mean, great. Looks like the trick worked. You see, when watching videos or browsing online, you're likely to encounter content that is loaded with emotional language, and with good reason. Playing into emotions, especially negative ones such as fear, anger, or contempt, is a trick to get you to pay attention to something when you otherwise wouldn't. It's likely that is a big part of the reason you're still watching this ad is because you were lured in by our use of emotional language in the very first sentence. Research has shown that expressing emotion is key for the spread of moral and especially political ideas in social networks. So let's say when you're writing a headline and you're trying your hardest to manipulate your readers to click. One thing you can do is pepper your headlines with a bunch of emotionally charged words. Call it a horrific accident instead of a serious one, a disgusting ruling instead of a disagreeable one, or a heartbreaking twist of faith instead of an unfortunate coincidence. That way, you're likely to reach more people and influence their reactions. So let's see how this plays out in real life. Let's take the following headline from the movie Anchorman. No emotional manipulation at play here, just to the point, no nonsense coverage of such an important event in world history. This headline, on the other hand, see what they did there? The writer used an emotionally charged word like revolting to describe a whole group of people. I mean, these people. Oh well, you get the point. They're fear-mongering. So whenever you feel outraged or angry, remember, someone may be pulling your strings. Don't be manipulated. Truth Labs, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Okay, so that gives you an idea.
You might think about
the videos that we presented to people. This was one explaining emotional language to them. They were then presented with tweets. Here's just one about an 8-year-old girl that was abducted at Disney World, and it was all, sort of absolutely terrible. And people had to tell us whether they thought this post was manipulative, whether it's trustworthy, and whether they would share this post with people in their social network, which of course is a very important consideration given this participatory propaganda issue that I mentioned at the outset. Now, we ran 5 experiments using different types of inoculation, different rhetorical techniques that we targeted. I showed you the video for language, but there were 4 others that did other rhetoric, such as false dichotomies, scapegoating, etc. Now, here are the data for 3 of the measures that we looked at: manipulativeness, trustworthiness, and sharing. And within each panel, each row of dots is one experiment. Now, there's a huge amount of, there's a large number of dots here, and you can probably not see them in great detail, but that's okay, because all I want you to focus on for the 3 measures are the red dots. The red dots refer to discernment, which I defined earlier as the difference or the ability to tell apart manipulative from non-manipulative tweets. If people can't discern anything, then the red dots would be on the vertical dotted line, and anything to the right of that dotted line tells us that the inoculation boosted people's discernment relative to the control condition. That's what the graphs mean. So if there were no effect at all, then the red dots would be on the dotted line. They're not. For all 3 measures, to varying extents, the red dots are significantly to the right, suggesting that information discernment was significantly improved by the inoculation video. So people are better able at picking the manipulativeness of posts. They find the manipulative posts less trustworthy than non-manipulative posts, and they're less likely to share manipulative posts than they would have done without the inoculation. So here we have something that works across a broad range of rhetorical techniques. Here's another experiment that we just finished a few weeks ago, where we combined different rhetorical techniques into a single video, and where we specifically trying to inoculate people against misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines that are circulating. So we took evoking emotion. You just saw what that might have looked like, together with, anti-vaccination activists always tell you to do your own research. Become a virologist on Google in 2 hours. And hasty generalizations. So we put that together in a training video, 3 or 4 minutes. We then presented people who were chosen to be neutral in their attitudes towards the vaccine, but had not been vaccinated yet. We presented them with misinformation that made use of these various different techniques. Here's just one illustrative example of a WhatsApp type message that somebody might have received from a friend, were they being discouraged from taking those vaccines. And then we did the same as we just did in the other experiments. We asked people to tell us how they felt about these messages. And when you then look at the data, we find that people's discernment of information taken upon, telling when they're being manipulated, people's ability to do that was higher after inoculation than in the control condition. And in the inoculation condition, people's concern about the vaccine also significantly decreased, despite the fact that they were exposed to the misinformation after the inoculation. So inoculation had this preemptive effect on people's attitudes towards the vaccine. And I want to push it one step further with another experiment on inoculation that was just published a little while ago, where we tried to target radicalization and extremist messages. So this is a pretty, this is a pretty tough thing to do, or at least there's a lot of concern that this might be difficult. Now, what we did here was the usual thing. We had a control condition in which they watched a video that has nothing to do with anything, and an experimental condition in which they watched an inoculation video that, again, summarized a number of misleading techniques used by people who seek to radicalize their audiences. Following that inoculation treatment, we then exposed people either to Islamophobic material in another video or Islamist. Now, note that these are completely opposing polarities. Islamophobic, right-wing Islamophobic versus Islamist material. And the inoculation video was completely neutral, didn't touch on Islam at all, never mentioned it. And so one of the key questions we asked here is, to what extent does inoculation generalize, and to what extent is it value neutral? Can you protect against opposing extremist material? And the answer is, in a nutshell, yes, you can inoculate people regardless of polarity. It doesn't matter where the extremism comes from. You can train people to identify the misleading techniques. This is the Islamist condition. So again, to clarify, people watched an inoculation video that told them about 3 or 4 different manipulative techniques used by disinformers. They were then exposed to gateway material to radical Islam. So, talking about the caliphate and how we must get rid of Western corrupt democracies and all that. You can imagine, we harvested this from YouTube. This is sort of paraphrasing actual radicalizing material. And what you find here is that on all the measures we used, inoculation reduced agreement, reduced anger, but reduced people's judgment that the videos were reliable. It made them less likely to share the video, and they supported the argument less. So on all these different measures, inoculation made people less susceptible to Islamist material. Now, what about Islamophobic? Well, here it is. And with one exception, it's exactly the same result. Less agreement, less judged reliability, less sharing, less support for the arguments. The only difference is that people get angrier with Islamophobic information after they've been inoculated than they otherwise would. Our interpretation is that they get even, they're so sensitized to being misled that they really get angry now when they're exposed to that radicalizing material. So, what's the current state of inoculation? Well, I've gone through a line of research just very briefly, and generally we find that using videos or textual material or even infographics, very brief treatments, enable people to become less resistant to misinformation afterwards and to be able to better discern between misleading rhetoric and non-misleading rhetoric. And that works across the political spectrum, and it also importantly works regardless of the polarity of radicalizing material. So I would put inoculation up there as one of the tools that we can use in combating the post-truth malaise. Now, there are other tools. For example, we can teach information discernment more broadly. Sam Weinberg and colleagues at Stanford have done some wonderful work that they have shown is successful with high school students after a relatively short treatment. And the treatment is to teach people how to evaluate the likely accuracy of a source on the internet. And the key insight by Sam and his colleagues is that you have to engage in something known as lateral reading. Lateral reading means that you do not stay on the website you're interested in order to assess whether it's reliable or not. Of course not, because even unreliable websites will try to look professional and will have a flag here that says we are reliable. Of course, it doesn't make much sense to look at the website itself. What you should do instead is to Google information about that website elsewhere and go to trustworthy sources that you think are more trustworthy, like fact checkers, maybe reputable mainstream media, and to then figure out how reliable that information is. Works beautifully. Students can learn it. They love doing this, and their information literacy increases. Jeff Walton, who's at this conference as well, has also done some work on information discernment, including developing a curriculum for teaching children or young adults that overcomes their default position of trusting anything that they see on the internet. So that's just a couple of pointers to other information that's out there. And the final tool I want to mention, because, well, it has to be mentioned, is debunking. What do you do with misinformation once it has been presented? I already told you it sticks at the very beginning. So if it sticks, is there anything we can do? Can it be debunked? Well, the answer to that is yes, but not quite. So the answer isn't entirely straightforward. But as I foreshadowed already at the outset, we have that ironic sort of dichotomy between people on the one hand updating their beliefs, so they say, on the other hand, however, still relying on it. Now, we've shown this in countless experiments. Given that I started out talking about Donald Trump, I'm now going to conclude by talking about Donald Trump again in the context of several experiments that my colleagues and I have conducted. What we did in all these experiments is to present people online in our experiments with statements by Donald Trump that were either true or false. And we then obtained belief ratings. To illustrate, a false statement by Donald Trump would have been one of several that we picked, that vaccines cause autism. Well, they don't. We know that with near certainty. So that's a false statement. But Donald Trump has also said things that are true, of course, namely, for example, that the US spent $2 trillion on the war in Iraq. Now, after we presented those statements and got belief ratings, we then followed the misinformation by a correction, said, no, actually that's false, and provided sources to document that. And the facts, we followed with an affirmation. That is, we said, yeah, well, that's actually correct. And we provided sources in support. So we kind of emphasized correctness and we corrected falsehoods. And then we repeated the belief rating in those specific claims, again, either immediately or a week later. And what we find is this: ignore the panel on the left, the one on the right is the one that matters. That's where the claims are identified as belonging to Donald Trump. Ignore the color of the lines for starters. Let's first focus on the distinction between the solid lines and the dotted lines. Solid lines are the facts, dotted lines is misinformation. Now, what you can see is that at the outset, before we intervened, people believed the facts a little more than the falsehoods. I mean, it wasn't a huge difference, but at least they were kind of, people knew on average what was true and what wasn't. Now, if we then tell them what was true and what was false, then they believe the truths a hell of a lot more and the falsehoods a lot less. So it's a huge effect here. The intervention, our treatment was highly effective. The truth versus falsehood was miles apart on our belief scale. And that persisted a week later. Now, yeah, there is some forgetting, but they're still remembering a great deal because they're doing much better than they would have done without the intervention. So that's pretty good in terms of debunking. Now, the second thing that's pretty good is if you now turn your attention to the color of the lines, then you find that this works across the political spectrum. Red are Trump supporters, Republican Trump supporters. Blue are Democrats, so probably not supporters of Donald Trump. And purple were people that existed at the time, this was done before the 2016 election, who were Republicans but did not support Donald Trump. Hey, in all cases, the intervention worked. There are some differences between those different political camps, but not a huge amount. Again, that's great. Debunking works, right? So where is the post-truth in this? Well, I would argue the post-truth is in those two panels, which is another aspect of our data where we asked people about their voting intentions ahead of that 2016 election and their feelings towards Donald Trump. And what you can see here is that the only thing that mattered, the one variable that mattered, was whether or not people believed in Trump or wanted to vote for him or liked him ahead of time. If they did, our experimental intervention made no difference. If they didn't, likewise, our experimental intervention made no difference. And if you look at the association between the degree of belief change after a correction of misinformation and a change in voting intentions, you find that there's no association. People are willing to change their belief about specific facts quite easily, but they do not change their voting intentions or their feelings about the candidate. Now, we've replicated this several times, and in one of the replications, we put in Bernie Sanders to test the other side of the political spectrum. We found exactly the same result, suggesting, this to my mind is very important, that direct belief measures in facts or falsehoods do not tell the full story about what information people rely on or how they feel about politicians. So whenever you hear that debunking is possible, I would say, yeah, sure. If you measure people's belief, you will get differences. But that doesn't mean that that belief change affects their political attitudes, their political behaviors, or indeed use of that information in different contexts. You can get people who knowingly spread falsehoods because they participate in propaganda. So knowledge of truth or belief ratings is not the full story. And with that, I think I've taken up my allocated 45 minutes, just I'm a minute short. And that's what I was trying to tell you. I wanted to tell you that the post-truth world is characterized by a different type of misinformation that's fairly newish, at least in Western democracies. And that disinformation, shock and chaos disinformation, comes with this epistemic insouciance. It's kind of like, hey, it doesn't matter what I say. I have alternative facts. And if you don't like it, well, then you're the one who's spreading fake news. It's important to understand that this only works under certain circumstances, that societies in which distrust or lack of faith in the system hasn't spread that far will not be susceptible to shock and chaos disinformation because people don't accept that. under normal circumstances, when people trust the society they live in, no one would buy into the lies that are sprouted by Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, Johnson in the UK, Orban in Hungary, you go wherever you want. You know, they're all cut from the same cloth, these populist politicians, and they're only accepted because of the societal circumstances that are supporting it. Now, that's no consolation because misinformation matters, it affects people's behavior. So we do have to contend with it. And what do? Well, I went through inoculation in some depth because I do believe that that is one way in which we can protect people against being misled by these post-truth politicians to the extent possible. But of course, in the long run, that crisis will not go away unless the circumstances improve where people are no longer susceptible to lying demagogues. And thank you for your attention. And I'm more than happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewandowsky, for this very inspiring and very interesting talk. May I ask you to stop sharing your screen so maybe we can?
Yes, I can. What I'll do is I'll pop the links to these various handbooks.
Oh, thank you very much.
Into the chat because I suspect that those might be of interest to people.
Definitely. And I see that there are some questions here. We have about 10 questions, and I really want to leave it to you how you like to proceed. They are in the chat box. Do you want to go through the questions and
I can happily, I just need to scroll back. Okay. Do you think people will value authenticity because it makes them? Yes. Well, identity, of course, is triggering people's identity is part of what's going on here. And I think what Donald Trump is doing, or others like him, is very much to underscore the identity of, the real people who are opposed to the elite. That's populism in a nutshell. What populists do is to arbitrarily divide all of us into either being part of the villainous elite or part of the virtuous people. Now, of course, neither exist, right? This is important to keep in mind. I mean, that people is not a single lump of individuals who are opposing the elite. Of course not. But populism works on that distinction. And so, yes, if Donald Trump says you're a part of the real people, the real Americans, that works incredibly well. And then all his lies, or that of other politicians like him, become signals also of tribal identity. So yes, I think there's evidence for that. The next question is about how long does the inoculation last? Very good question. We're running the experiment right now to see how far we can push it. We have preliminary insight from a paper that was published recently by Mertens et al., where they showed that it lasts up to a month, provided there are testing episodes along the way that we think remind people of the inoculation. So we already know that if you just remind them, it'll last up to a month. What we don't know yet is how long it'll last without that, and whether, if there is decay, which I suspect there is, whether very brief booster shots might be able to lift people's performance. We don't know that yet, but I'll have the answers in a few weeks. Okay, the next one about COVID-19. How do you explain some medical doctors and health professionals can become anti-vax after receiving education, etc.? Well, first of all, vaccine hesitancy among healthcare professionals is a serious issue. It's not something we can take lightly because they're known to be the most important communicators of vaccination decisions. Now, fortunately, the level of hesitancy among medical professionals is actually very low. It is very low among doctors. It is higher among nurses. And if you look at the amount of training that people receive to their hesitancy, then you find that actually the more education they receive on vaccination, the less hesitant they become. So what you're saying here in the question that education may make them more hesitant, we don't find any support for that. We find, on the contrary, that one of the problems is that nurses, for example, in the United Kingdom, I think get a grand total of 2 hours in their entire training, 2-hour lecture on vaccinations, and that's it. So if anything, I think there's a lack of education there. And we have a project going at the moment called JITSUVAX, funded by Horizon 2020, where we look at precisely that, ways to increase vaccine knowledge among healthcare professionals. Can we inoculate people for advanced technologies that don't exist yet? Interesting question. What you can inoculate people against is misleading rhetoric, regardless of what that misleading rhetoric is targeting. Well, that's my generous interpretation of the data we've had, because in all cases, everything I showed you, the inoculation material was as neutral as possible. Well, you saw the video, that had nothing to do with politics, as far as we can tell. We made it humorous and kind of engaging. This was a professional videographer who did this, all of the videos. And we show that it works on material that is completely unrelated. We even show that inoculation can work with a radicalizing material. So if you know ahead of time how somebody might mislead people about modern or new technologies, then I think you'll be able to do this. Stephan asked, how can this be scaled up to an entire society? Well, that's the $1 million question. And the $1 million answer, I think, is that it could be done quite easily if the social media platforms saw fit to do so, because, on YouTube, you can have an ad ahead of a video. And if it's sufficiently short, then people can't escape from the ad. And we're now working on videos that are that short, so they cannot be escaped. And you may be intrigued to hear that research is funded by Jigsaw, which is Google's think tank. So maybe there's a link from Jigsaw to YouTube in the future. We don't know that yet. Inoculation or vaccination, well, we call it inoculation, but yes, it's an analogy to the medical issue of vaccination. Okay, how do you approach people who sincerely believe that different lies are being told? Yes, well, that of course is a serious problem, that you will encounter people who are deeply down the rabbit hole and will say that the only truth out there is on the internet, and whatever the government tells me and whatever a doctor tells me is necessarily wrong. Now, fortunately, in many Western countries, the number of those people is relatively small. It depends on where you go, depends on, lots of factors. In the US, unfortunately, it's not that small. But in the UK and Germany and Holland, the number of those people is very small. Now, what we know from the available research is that a lot of people who engage in conspiratorial rhetoric will do so because it's a tool of convenience. It's very easy for me to say, hey, climate change is a hoax, because then I can fly to Bali on holiday without feeling guilty. And that's arguably, I think, what a lot of people do. It's just kind of, oh, COVID is a hoax. Then I don't have to wear a mask. I can go to the pub. I can ignore social distancing. I can just soothe my feelings of guilt by engaging in that rhetoric. Now, the people who engage in conspiratorial rhetoric for that reason are reachable through interventions, including inoculation, but also debunking. There's evidence for that. The other type of person for whom the conspiracy has become part of their identity they're extremely difficult to reach. And I unfortunately don't have a silver bullet for that at all. The only literature we have that can help us with this is the literature on de-radicalization of former terrorists and cult members. Because effectively, you're talking about the psychology of cults and extremism here. By the time you get to QAnon and people who say that, whatever, that the CDC is running concentration camps for children or, all these bizarre ideas. By the time you get there, it's not going to be easy to get them out of there. And I'll put another link in the chat to the conspiracy theory handbook, which does at least point to some of the literature that is available on that, but it's not easy, I'm afraid. Okay. Yes, okay. Sheila asked about the broader impact of these misleading techniques, that they become more and more widespread. Is there a broader educational issue? Well, absolutely. I think there is. I think there's a hugely broad educational issue about, public discourse. Part of the problem is, the way I see it, that the technology has just advanced, in leaps and bounds, and society hasn't kept track at all with how to cope with that, how to teach people how to deal with this. So yes, there's a huge issue there. There's also an issue, this goes on to the next question, is moderating by the media not an alternative option? Well, it's not just by the media, it is also by governments and public bodies, because one of the things, I'll put a final link in the chat because that's an issue dear to my heart, and I just published a report for the European Commission on that. One of the problems we're having right now is that effectively the information diet of the majority of people in the Western world is determined by a dozen people in Silicon Valley who started out as social media entrepreneurs, had no idea what they were doing, and developed algorithms that exposed people to stuff they like so that the entrepreneurs could make more money through advertising. Now, no one knew when this started what was going to happen. And we're now in a situation where unaccountable, unaccounted for, unaudited, unknown algorithms designed to maximize profits for Facebook and YouTube, they govern what the public sees in terms of political messages. Now, I do not believe for a second that any democratic country would have intentionally agreed to this if we had known ahead of time what's going on. If 20 years ago somebody had said, oh, here's the model for the future, do you like this? Governments would have said, well, don't even think about it. Of course not, it's crazy. It's crazy, I find. And yet it has evolved because the technology moves so fast. So I think there's a huge deficit here, not just of education, but also of regulation. Now, by that, I don't mean censorship, but I do mean auditing and public accountability of algorithms. We know that Facebook knows that their algorithms are radicalizing and polarizing Americans. We know that. The Wall Street Journal reported that, of all places. We also know that Facebook knows how to fix that, but they won't because they're worried about how it impinges on their bottom line. Now, to me, that's not, personally, I find that unacceptable. I also know that the European Commission finds that unacceptable. And I hope that there is quite a bit of forthcoming legislation in Europe, at least at the European level, that aims to deal with that. And that legislation, I think, is crucial. And if it's done properly, will do a lot of the work for us, because education alone isn't going to do this. There's an elephant in the room, and that is the social media platforms, algorithms, and what they do to people's information dying. And we have to get that under control if we want to have any hope of dealing with this problem. Okay, anything else? I think, oh, how transferable is information literacy? I think that'll be the last one I'll address, because then I'll be out of time. Well, very good question. From our experience, it's surprisingly transferable. I mean, our inoculation that was completely neutral transferred to both Islamist and Islamophobic context. Now those two things, you know, they're about as opposed to each other as you can get. I mean, right-wing Islamophobia and Islamist pro-caliphate kind of material. I can't think of anything that's more different, really. Wow, psychologically, they're the same people, in my opinion. In fact, we know that extremists are extremists. It doesn't matter what they're extreme about. But the fact that we can inoculate against both from a neutral intervention is fairly promising as far as the transfer is concerned. But you know, that's just one experiment. Well, we have several others, but it's not it's not the end of the story yet. But I'm optimistic on that. Okay, it's 11:30, I think. I don't know. Are we out of time?
Yes, but we could listen to you for a longer time if you had,
Okay.
time to answer a couple of more questions. But
Sure.
there were so many.
I'm
If you don't
happy.
mind, maybe a couple of more questions, another
Sure,
5
I'm
minutes.
happy. I'm happy. Yeah, there's one more in the. Have I? Right. Yes, a comment. I think it's a very good comment. It's very hard to divide just the information aspect from politicians' statements, as there are many other hidden motivations involved, and what they say publicly is not necessarily what they genuinely believe personally. Well, the last, let me pick up on the last point, just amplify that. Yes, of course. I mean, I know a lot of politicians, weeks or months, and they believe the exact opposite of what they're now proclaiming to be the case. I mean, it is fascinating to watch, and it's to me it's most obvious in Britain, which in my view is now being it's sort of a, gosh, what's the best way to put this? It's a large scale experiment on how far you can gaslight the population when it comes to Brexit. I mean, it is just stunning if you consider the what British politicians said in the lead up to the referendum in 2016 and what they say now, and there's just no overlap for a lot of the people who were opposing Brexit based on what at the time seemed to be their belief, and who are now selling it to the public as being the only future possible, which would also, there's just no connection, none. No, I mean, just none. And the reason I think that's psychologically relevant is because the public, you would think that the public might cotton on to that and say, well, wait a minute, this guy is now selling me the same thing that they said was unsellable and completely stupid 2 weeks ago. What's going on here? Well, what I think is going on here is that, and there's evidence for this, that the public's attention span and memory for what's going on has been shrinking because there's an oversupply of information, and there is quantitative data that is tracing this out. A Twitter hashtag that on average was gone wild for like 20 hours a few years ago is now going wild for like 14 hours or something. I'm not sure I got the numbers exactly right. That's a paper by Lawrence Strain and colleagues that I think came out last year, where they showed that. But in a very rapid, just 3 or 4 years, there's a measurable decline in people's attention span. And I think hashtags are a fairly good indicator of a society's attention span. And if something falls off the end of your attention span after 17 hours, well, then you're not going to hold a politician accountable for something they said more than 17 hours ago. And I think that is also a serious problem that arises from just the sheer quantity of information. And that, I think, is also one of the reasons why Donald Trump is so good at what he does, which is he just pumps out so much stuff that no one will even dream of holding him accountable, because it's a full-time job for 15 people to just keep track of what he's uttering in a week and how many twists and turns he puts in there. So, yeah, and I honestly don't know what to do about that, although I think there used to be a time when we used to have something called journalism, where journalists used to do this sort of work and said, hey, this guy's contradicting himself. I wonder what's going on here. But to my knowledge, that is somehow no longer being practiced. I may be wrong, maybe I'm overlooking them, but I certainly in Britain, I haven't seen anybody doing that. Any other questions?
Well, I think now it's time to close the session. Thank you so much for being with us and for this very inspiring speech of yours. Thank you,
Right.
Mr. Lewandowski.
Thanks so much for having me. I got to run. I have other commitments, but it was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.